Okay, let me look presentable.
All right. So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Henry George School. And we are very pleased and honored to have you with us today for this special webinar on the progressive era, featuring a book presentation on this very interesting period of American history. So our speaker today is Dr. Guillaume Vallet from the University of Grenoble, Alpes. I will soon allow our good friend and board member at the Henry George School, Mr. Dr. Alex Gevorkian, who will be moderating this event. Dr. Gevorkian is the Henry George Chair in Economics and Associate Professor of Economics at the Department of Economics and Finance of the Peter J. Tobin College of Business at St. John's University, New York City. Dr. Gevorkian is also a senior fellow at the Vincentian Center for Church and Society, a research fellow at the Center of Global Business Stewardship, and a board member at the Henry George School. He is the author of a very interesting book that was published, I believe, a year or two ago on transition economies, transformation, development of society, and Eastern Europe, and the former Soviet Union. So you can, of course, acquire a copy of that book. It's available on Amazon, Google, and you can also get your hard copy. So anyway, I'm gonna pass it over to Alec for him to introduce our speaker of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahima. That's quite an introduction of my bio. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. I'll try to be very brief. Before I introduce our speaker, just the general rules of webinars. We're staying mute, and if I see your microphone unmuted, I will try to mute it, or Ibrahima will help me.
Sure.
I think you need to now sign me up as a co-host to be able to do this. As far as questions, if possible, let's have them towards the end. But if something comes up sort of during the presentation, just type them in the chat room, and I will keep an eye on that. So now, with all the sort of housekeeping things set away, our guest of honor is a colleague and a friend and someone whose work I've learned about, with whom I met, I guess, within the past couple of years, 2 years or so, and whose work has been very impressive and interesting and very relevant to sort of the mission of Henry George School of Social Science. This latest book that our guest will talk about covers some of these specific topics that relate to Henry George. So Guillaume Vallet is Associate Professor in Economics, University of Grenoble, Alpes, and Research Fellow at Centre, pardon, I can't speak French, de Recherche en Économie de Grenoble, and Institut de Recherche pour l'Économie Politique de l'Entreprise in France. What really should impress everyone is that Guillaume has 2 PhDs, one in economics, one in sociology. And I think I will need to quiet down myself because the street noise is probably overwhelming right now. So without further ado, Dr. Vallet, Guillaume, please, the floor is yours. And we're looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alec, for this presentation. Thank you very much also with Ibrahima for organizing this webinar. It's a great pleasure for me. I am truly honored to be here today and to present this very important topic, namely the progressive era, in relation to the publication of the book I edited, Inequalities and the progressive era. I am going to share my screen because I have prepared a PowerPoint on this topic, and yeah, like this. As you may know, the progressive era covers period beginning in the 1890s and ending in maybe the beginning of the 1820s. As its name suggests, the progressive era calls to mind a large raft of policy advances which dramatically changed American society. Although this vision truthfully reflects a tangible historical reality, I think that we cannot view the progressive era as unfolding smoothly over time. Because within this 30-year span period lie several distinct sub-periods instead of a single macro phase, including, for instance, the Gilded Age, the American industrial takeoff, the issue of class warfare in the US, or of course the Roaring 20s at the beginning of the 20s. And I think that we can say the period was a double-edged sword for Americans, namely an era characterized by deep changes and continuity. As far as the changes are concerned, mention should be made of the end of slavery, for instance. The period covers the second industrial revolution, which is very important in my view. Likewise, this was the beginning of the challenging of the natural fixed social order in relation to the social Darwinism, for instance. And of course, we can also mention, as it is written on the slide, the institutionalization of the social sciences. It was the beginning of the creation of the major academic institutions in the US, and this changed the way of American knowledge for good at this time. But also, of course, there was also a kind of continuity with the previous period, especially in relation to the functioning of the American democracy. There was still the kind of representative democracy. There was the freedom of speech. There was the religious tolerance. And this is really important because there were a lot of moral issues at that time. And as Dewey said, what can hardly believe there has been a revolution in history so extensive, so complete. So it was a very important period characterized by deep changes. And I think, in my view, the main issue of the time was the building of the American nation. And of course, in relation to the kind of capitalism of that time. And to me, there are three main underpinning issues of the building of the American nation. First, we can say that the progressive era was characterized by a deep industrialization, deep and rapid industrialization. As you can see with the figures here, there were a lot of changes on that topic. Secondly, there was also strong urbanization, and this was very important to question immigration, for instance, and to be able to think about the designing of new social policies, for instance. So it was very important to. It is very important to stress the second feature of the progressive era. And finally, as I have mentioned, there was also the issue of immigration. Here I indicate a figure between 1890 and 1920. Some 25 million immigrants flooded the US. So it was very important, and the Statue of Liberty in New York maybe exemplifies this phenomenon. Because it was the first thing the migrants saw when they arrived in the US. And in this context, we observed a rise in inequalities in different areas. Of course, we often think about the industrial question, which was very important in the US, but there was also the issue of the regulation of child labor, for instance. Likewise, the woman question was very important. I am working now on a very important feminist, American feminist of the time, namely Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and she wrote very interesting things on this issue. And of course, maybe last but not least, the racial question was there in relation to immigration, in relation to eugenics as well. And in this context, the issue of progress was addressed. And I think this is a very important issue because the thinkers of the time tried to foresee the future, try to forecast the kind of economic and social policies could be implemented to improve the global well-being of Americans. However, I think that beside the US, similar trends of thought emerged in other parts of the world, which share the goal of human progress as well. One key feature of the progressive era was the increased mobility of some social groups, such as intellectuals. And I think it's important to remind that many of the intellectuals of the American intellectuals of the time went abroad to study in Germany, for instance. To that end, the German historical school was very influential to these American authors. But as a result, the intelligentsia could draw parallels between differing contexts and gradually began to believe in the possibility of spreading reform from one society to the next. The progressive era was a time of profound upheavals and whose intellectual landscape bore the marks of pioneering thinkers from all corners of the globe. This is the sign that the world was changing everywhere at the time. And this is why I decided to know more about this period, of course, in the US, but also in the world. And this is why I decided to edit a book on this issue. So the book entitled Inequality and the Progressive Era, Breakthroughs and Legacies, before presenting very briefly the content of each chapter, I would like to emphasize that this book is the outcome of a collective work from the onset to the end. I would like to thank from the bottom of my heart all the authors who are mentioned here, but also I would like to thank also the people in my university who helped me in this project. Thank you also to Edward Elgar for the publication of the book. And last but not least, I will mention the name Alec pronounced before the presentation. I would like to thank Louis-Philippe Rochon, Professor Rochon from the Laurentian University, Canada, who gave me the opportunity to publish this book and always gave me his support. So to give very briefly, but to give more insights on the content of the book, I will say a few words on each part of it. The first part, the foundations of inequalities, investigates the roots of the intellectual thought of the period. And in my view, Richard Ely is definitely the most prominent thinker of the time because of his influence on other intellectuals through the concepts he coined, through his methods, and through his reflections on the issue of property, especially. And the first chapter by Michel Rocca is dedicated to Richard Ely. Likewise, my chapter on Beyond Small, or the chapter of Chassagnon and Dubriand on the old institutionalism is in relation to Ellie's thought. And very interestingly, we can learn that Ellie's thought has also an influence abroad, has an influence overseas. For instance, Japanese economists and social scientists built some connections with Ellie, and his first book was translated in Japanese at the time. So it was very rare at the time to be translated in Japanese. And the chapter of Tanaka on the influence Ellie had on Japanese thinkers of the time is very interesting. But beyond the pioneering influence of Ellie, this first part is also dedicated to the idea of the founding of new academic knowledge in the US or elsewhere. Parker's chapter is dedicated to the Chicago School of Columbus, for instance. Likewise, a very interesting chapter written by my colleague at the University of Grenoble, Thierry Schrecker, focuses on the foundation, on the founding of the new School for Social Research in New York. So we know more about its history and the will its founders had in mind when they decided to create this very important and progressive school. And finally, we learn a lot of things from the chapter of Alex Milmo on dedicated to the thought of Douglas Copeland in Australia, who, like other thinkers of the time, build strong relationships with American thinkers. So this first part was really useful. It's very useful to know more about the foundations of inequalities, especially from the academic knowledge on it. The second part is dedicated to the issue of inequalities in different areas. We begin with Morrison's focus on income inequalities during the 1880-1930 period, in order to have a large overview on inequalities, income inequalities of the time. Then we turn to Skidelsky's chapter, stressing that distribution is a macroeconomic problem in relation to the treatment of inequalities. Likewise, Mirden's chapter dealing with Henry George thought is crucial to cope with the tariff question and the labor question. As you know better than me, Henry George was very influential to many authors of the time of the progressive era, and also he was very influential to the policies that were devised at the time. And finally, the remaining chapters focus on other types of inequalities. Pat Thane deals with gender inequalities in the UK, while Nikulin and Babashkin focus on land inequalities in Russia. And this is what Granda does for the case of Ecuador. Echoing Parker's chapter, Catherine Momi's chapter on Frank Lloyd Wright focuses on the possibility of the emergence of an organic capitalism through the redesigning of urban spaces. And this is in connection with what I have said before, because immigration led to rethinking the way the city could be organized. And the thought of Frank Lloyd Wright is very interesting to that view, in order to know more how to create a new type of city in order to reduce the inequalities and to build a better world. Finally, the third part is dedicated to the issue of reducing social inequalities. And to that aim, this part elaborates on the neglected views of key thinkers of the time, coming from different corners of the globe, some of them being sometimes underestimated. We've got a chapter from Lacomsky-Laguerre on Schumpeter's views on social inequalities. Bob Diamond treats the case of Leacock in Canada. Pressman and Briggs deals with the thought of Du Bois in the US regarding race inequalities. We have also chapters on neglected African thinkers of the time, Horton or Plage in South Africa. And finally, there are also chapters on Marianne Weber and Salome by Christine Castellin-Meunier, and on Silvio Gesell, a chapter which is written by Florencia Sember. As I work on monetary issues, I know that Gesell was very important to many thinkers of the time. Hayek praised his work. Keynes praised his work too, especially because Gesell coined the concept of melting money, and the chapter of Florencia Sember treats this issue. In sum, each of these authors of the progressive era addressed key issues on race inequalities, gender inequalities, monetary inequalities, or eugenics in relation to different geographical and cultural contexts. I think it is worth reminding the relevance of geographical and cultural context to address the issue of inequalities during the progressive era. For that reason, maybe last but not least, the last chapter of the book, written by Professor Bernard Aubois, is devoted to the football culture in Brazil, which embodies many challenges of the country during this period, race inequalities in particular. So this is a kind of overview of the content of the book, and I would like to maybe to draw two remarks from the previous developments. First, our chosen period, which starts in the 1890s and ends in the 1930s, at the beginning of the 1930s, encompasses more than the usual time span. Besides vindicating some historical research, this allows for greater coherence, in my view. The beginning of the 30s was characterized by inequalities caused by the Great Depression, as well as by innovative public policies devised as a response to them. It therefore appears necessary to connect this period to the pioneering ideas beforehand, which gave rise to the upheavals of the 30s. This also explains why some chapters are dedicated to some authors who gained ground during this decade, such as Gesell, that I have mentioned, or Schumpeter, for instance. The second feature of this work is the wealth of its contributions from international authors, each of whom sketch out a unique facet of the progressive era. Each contributor has dealt with a particular type of inequality, focusing on a specific geographical area or on the responses of progressive thinkers to their particular contexts. Our decision to focus on other progressive thinkers than mere American ones reflects the willingness to address the issue of inequalities in its different forms and meanings, and thus to rethink what inequalities mean and refer to. Likewise, our decision to broaden the geographical scope to Europe, Asia, Africa, or Oceania, for instance, reflects a willingness to illustrate the global impact of the progressive era. And this is why the content of the book challenges the idea of American exceptionalism, which had been a point of serious contention among American intellectuals as early as the 1860s. And of course, this is why, in my view, America's progressive era cannot be easily divorced from its global context. Therefore, the book explores this period, which was both eventful for the United States as well for a number of other countries, as far as the issue of inequalities is concerned. Whichever form inequalities took, they ceased to be branded as natural, unavoidable, or normal. And this is the main point of the book. In this regard, the progressive era was a turning point in the sense that it saw a shift in the perception of inequalities among all the key sections of society, in academia, as well as in the media and in the political class. To conclude, I would like to say that it is certain that it is always risky to try to draw some historical parallels between different periods. The progressive era has its own historical features and specificities, especially those related to the building, the preservation and expansion of democracy and of nations, with their positive and negative aspects. It should be reminded that during this era, many nation states were formed. This was the case in France, for instance, sometimes through abrupt convulsions, such as the First World War, and that colonialism solidified its hold elsewhere, especially for European countries. Such a context was characterized by imperialism, as well as the building of a gendered capitalism. And we have several chapters in the book which are dedicated to the gender issue that remind that. This is why progressives treated in this book, American in particular, focused mainly on the issue of the equality of opportunity with a kind of fighting spirit that should not be underestimated. These intellectuals thought to design a meritocratic social order where each individual would occupy a position reflecting their ability to realize their potential in evolving societies. And regarding the latest issue, namely this ability for each individual to reach a kind of equality of opportunity, I think this is for this reason that we can try to learn from the progressive era, since some of its facets still ring true today or still influence our societies. So in my view, this is some of the lessons we can draw from this period. First, we can say that excessive inequalities are a threat to democracy, especially because they prevent individuals from reaching their equality of opportunity. And second, one of the main legacies of the progressive thinkers, in my view, was to think more about the concept of property. Because to many progressives of the time, property was a collective matter. It was not only an individual characteristic, it was a collective matter. We have to think about this legacy, I think, because regarding the modern functioning of the firm in particular, we can say that the firm is a real social entity ruled by complex social relationships, and then the firm cannot be reduced to property rights or to a bundle of contracts. The firm only exists through the willingness of individuals involved together in this structure, implying that only shareholders would own the stocks of the firm, but the shareholders only possess the capital of the firm, but not the firm itself. And I think that since all individuals of the firm are involved in the organization in order to produce, we should think the firm as a chain and to rethink the concept of property is crucial to that issue. And this is why I go back to Albion Small's thought, because he coined three interesting types of capital in order to think about this issue. What he named the tool capital, the management capital, and the finance capital. This is what I explained in the book, and I think it's really important. And this is also why, in Small's views, the law matters, because the law creates visible categories and then enables public policies to be designed. So this is very important. So this is why I turn to my third point, the fact that public policies are key, because of course today we need direct distribution, we need to rethink taxation. Very eminent scholars such as Piketty have stressed that point. But there are also non-satisfied collective needs which require public investment. This is a matter of development, and this is the case in Europe, and the current COVID crisis exemplifies this need. And I go back once again to Small, who called for the taxation of stockholders in order to limit their power, but also in order to be able to have funds to implement new public policies. I also mention Henry George, who coined interesting ideas on the taxation of land to unleash production, as well as to prevent inequalities from arising. Rent taxation is a good way to avoid land speculation and the building of great fortunes. In France, it has been a major problem for more than 20 years. And in the US as well, as far as I know, it's also a problem. Specifically, the racial wealth gap is a matter of the value of the houses people own, because housing is the bulk of personal wealth for ordinary people. The taxation of land could be a way to redesign zoning in urban spaces and then to reduce inequality. My fourth point is about an important problem progressives stressed, namely the link between people and elites in democracy. And then we can address very important issues today. Do elites really serve the people in the context of delegated power and in the context of the unelected framework of democracy? Do they act for people, or do they act for their own sake? What do we do with populism as a political ideal on the belief that populism is also a virtue of the people? Because a century ago, for many progressives, progressivism in its original form sought to harness the energy of populism to expert the opinion and leadership. So I think it's very important to be able to devise new ideals, to devise new projects and new progress for society. It seems today that we have no project for the future. We have no ideals, and this is a lack and a big problem for the functioning of our democracies and for the young generations. So we have to solve this kind of problem. And then, last but not least, I stress an important point: which types of academics for which society? I mean here, what kind of social scientist do we want today? We have seen, and the recent events in France exemplify that we need education. We need an academic knowledge, because this knowledge is key in democracy, to educate people, to share ideas, to explore some new things, and to create debates. And then we cannot rest on academics as mere technicians. This is the case especially for economists. We cannot rely on economists that only do measures, that only measures things, that are only able to devise or do technical things, in my view. We should be able, as economists or as social scientists, we should be able to devise ideals, to think about new ways of living, implying maybe some time to take side on some topics. And this is why I think that the lines, the frontiers between positive and normative social sciences are blurred in reality. And this is maybe one of the lessons that we can draw from the thinkers of the progressive era who were aware of that. So thank you very much for your attention. I finish on here, and it was a pleasure to be here today. Thank you once again very much to all of you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Imagine there's virtual applause somewhere. No, you've touched on so many interesting points. I prepared a list of questions, handwritten, sent to you, and of course illegible. But let me just tell you, you touched on most of them. My interest was about sort of the global effect of the movement. Yeah, and sort of how it sort of involved other people across the world, because what we can see from the book is that there's a wide scope sort of countries, right, that are covered, that are brought up in the conversation. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that as well, because but let me make this my second question, because I think that's important, and I have something that I can better contextualize with. But since we're at the Henry George School of Social Science, my first question has to be inevitably related to Henry George. And if you could maybe talk a little bit more for the audience and everyone who will be listening to this later, about the role that Henry George played as far as influencing and kind of shaping, maybe forming the direction of the what we call progressive era. But I have so many other things to mention. I mean, one could think, or rather, you mentioned economists who just measure and model things. And I actually had a Twitter exchange with someone about this today. But sometimes people put things sort of in compartments, right, and break out in small groups. And for example, in arts, we think about sort of the classic art of some type, or impressionists, or people who worked in abstract. But we can clearly identify individuals. We do the same in economics. We have Austrian economists, we have neoclassical economists, and so on. We can clearly identify the names. But with the progressive era, was that also some type of this group of individuals across the world? You mentioned how important it was for them to communicate, the mobility of intellectuals, or was it more of a general movement? And this is where the question about Henry George's role in this. Okay, that's a broad question.
So thank you very much, Alec, for your question. So I'm not the best specialist on Henry George, but I can say, of course, a few things on him. I think that his big idea was that the capital and labor are productive, but rent is not. So if you are able to tax rent, you are able to you could be able to abolish all other taxes and then to unleash production. So that could be a very interesting point today, because as I have said, in many countries the issue of the rent coming from land has become a big problem, because, for instance, in France, if you want to become the owner of a flat or of a house, you have to inherit from land, because the prices are so expensive that it creates problems, and it could also create some kinds of gated communities in cities, and this is quite new in France. So this is a way to distribute the wealth thanks to the taxation of rent, and I think this is a great legacy from Henry George. But the second point related to this is that you can be able to devise a kind of zoning in urban cities, because if you tax some places in the cities, you will change the way people think about the organization of the cities, and then leading to a kind of a greater melting pot, if I can say that, in the cities. And to many extent, Henry George was also influential on this issue to the first school of sociology in Chicago that emerged during the progressive era. Because in Chicago, people were the social scientists of the Department of Sociology of Chicago had in mind to be able to design a new kind of city with a more cohesive city, thanks to the redesigning of its different neighborhoods. And this is for instance, what Parker explains in his chapter in the book. So to me, as far to my knowledge, this is the reasons why I can say that Henry George had very interesting and progressive ideas and was influential to many progressive thinkers of the time. And of course, he also had very interesting ideas on the tariffs issue, that I am less specialist on that.
We actually have a couple of specialists on the call right now, and I will be happy to give them an opportunity to ask a question in just a moment. Just a reminder to the audience, please, you feel free to raise your hand as an option in Zoom, or type your questions in the chat room. But Guillaume, I do have one more question that I'd like to ask now before turning to the audience, and that is the following. In the book, from at least I was able to glance, you mentioned how the 1930s reforms, many of which in the United States we are benefiting from now, and because I can only reduce it to examples that I understand, things such as minimum wage, or the federal deposit insurance, in general, health benefits, unemployment benefits, and so on, right? What you mentioned in the book is that and in general, sort of the New Deal of 1930s was not an outcome of the Depression, but it was a continuation of the progressive era. I'm wondering if you could just clarify this a little bit more for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alec. Of course, there is a connection between the specificity of the context related to the Great Depression and the policies that were implemented at the time, and I don't want to deny the fact this is true, but I also want to mention that the ideas that Roosevelt had in mind did not appear suddenly, because he was advised by several intellectuals or academics who were influenced by the ideas of the progressive era. And many of these ideas were also tested locally, for instance, in the Wisconsin in relation to the income, the unemployment income you mentioned, for instance. So this was really really important. So as I have said, for me, of course, in the 30s, are also characterized by this process, but there was, of course, changes, but also a kind of continuity with the previous decades. And I think that some of the legacies of the progressive era occurred during the beginning of the 30s with the progressive, with the Great Depression. To me, the concept, the name of New Deal exemplifies what I am saying, because it's not only about implementing a unique policy or another, it's about a way to create a new social relationship between people. It's about a way to devise a new project for all in order to create a new type of America and to improve the global well-being in the context of the Great Depression. And this is what the progressive thinkers had in mind. They wanted the progress for all. They wanted to devise a new type of society. They wanted a new deal for the US.
Okay, very interesting. So it's we should view it as a continuous social project evolution. I very much like that, but I will leave my comments aside. So we have a couple of questions, and the first one, I know, very impatient. Marty, Dr. Marty Roland would you like to ask your question? You have your hand up, and you also had a question earlier in the presentation. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, appreciate it, Alex, and I really appreciate the opportunity to participate and ask questions. I guess before I ask a question, I just want to let people know that I'm reading a 2015 book that might be a good addition to this book by Edward O'Donnell called Henry George and the Crisis of Inequality. It's kind of unique because it really gets into the background of what's going on in terms of, for example, the what's going on with the Irish politics and unrest, I suppose. But I do have to apologize that I haven't read Mr. Vallet's book, but I was interested in finding out why 1890s was selected as the beginning of the progressive era. Is that something that you borrowed from somebody else, or did you independently agree with that, considering that Henry George died in 1897? I was thinking that we could have included more of Henry George's thoughts if we said 1880s maybe. Could you address that?
Thank you very much for your question and for the book you mentioned. I will try to read it also. Yes, that you are right. I could have included maybe the decade, the previous decade, and especially because there was the thought of Henry George in it. But if I have decided to focus more from the 1890s onward, maybe it's because for me it was the beginning of the institutionalization of the social sciences in the US. The first department of sociology was officially created in Chicago in 1892, for instance. It was also the beginning of the creation of very important academic journals, such as the American Journal of Sociology, for instance. So once again, of course, this decade is related to the previous one, and I had to make some choices. But you're totally right. I could have included the decade before, of course.
But I think we could view it more of as not a hard cutoff line, but more of a general sort of trend, a time trend, a time period, because it gives a reader, especially who is not a specialist, some idea, okay, how to orient themselves in historical time. So I would defend that choice from that point of view. Ed Dodson, do you still have your question? Would you like to ask?
I didn't really have a question. I just was responding to Marty's comment about capitalism. Okay. It's my view that depending on one's definition of capitalism, we've never enjoyed capitalism. And it seems to me that what we've had from the very beginning is landlordism, and landlordism has just morphed. It started out as agrarian, added commercial when people started to raise sheep and cattle on the land. Then it became industrial, and then you added the financial sector. And so what you end up with is a system that has to be called, but by a very long term to be accurate. And that is agrarian, commercial, industrial, financial, landlordism. And that's what we have. And that's not capitalism if one agrees that the widespread ownership of capital goods is a definition of real capitalism. That's it.
Very interesting. As someone who studies post-socialist Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union, I kind of often mention that it wasn't real socialism over there. But Guillaume, do you have any comments or response to Ed's point?
No, not more. I think it's very, very interesting, and no, I don't have anything to add to this point.
Okay. I think Diana's was more of a comment.
Dan Sullivan.
Oh, Ibrahima, go ahead.
Dan Sullivan has a question.
I'm going by the way they're appearing in chat room, so yeah, I'm quite aware. Ravi Chandran had a question.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, my question is basically, when I do my own reading of history, it seems like when you look at today, the two major political parties in the United States, the Democrats and Republicans, seem to have a lot of ideological consistency, throughout within their parties. Was that the case in the progressive era? Because I always heard about terms like liberal Republican, conservative Democrat, and it seemed that there was a lot of heterogeneity within the political parties. Maybe it was based on regionalism, I don't know. So I'm just curious about that. Were there progressive Republicans? Were there progressive Democrats? I'm curious about that.
Thank you very much for your question. As far as I know, one of the main point was the racial issue, which created a kind of split between Republicans and Democrats. Historically, at this time, Democrats, a lot of Democrats were in favor of slavery, or were kind of nostalgic from this period, and some Republicans were more progressive on that. And what was really uncomfortable to me when I read some things on the history of the United States, and especially the work of James McPherson, the one of the persons who wrote the endorsement at the end of the book, was that some progressives coming from or linked to the Democrat Party were very ambiguous on the racial issue. For instance, they were in favor of eugenics. Some of them were also in favor of segregation for Black people, either because for them it was a way to protect Black people, in the sense that if you don't do anything, people are going to kill the Black people, or are going to not treat them not very well. So maybe this kind of laws are better than nothing. But some others were in favor of a different treatment, because they really firmly believed that there were a kind of hierarchy between the races, and including the migrants in the US. The different races cannot evolve following the same path, and many of them were really firmly believed on that. So I think, in my view, beyond the debates on protection between versus free trade, such as Henry George mentioned, there was this main issue dedicated to the race question that created a kind of split between the two parties. And on that point, maybe more Republicans were progressive.
Yeah, actually, Yanis mentioned in the comments the progressives were mostly Republicans. Dan, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, it follows up on that. The progressive movement grew out of the abolitionist movement. In fact, the first group to call itself progressives was a Quaker, the Society of Progressive Friends, and their main thing was abolition. And that gave a flavor that was the difference between the progressive approach and the socialist approach, because the progressives always said there's always some underlying privilege we can abolish. So they were abolitionists, not just with slavery, but in general, whatever was wrong, they said there's got to be something to remove. And the word progressive became very popular when Progress in Poverty was published in the Law of Human Progress. But the socialists constantly attacked the progressives and continued right up till 1960. They were attacking JFK because he was a progressive. But the progressive movement died and everybody forgot what it meant. So around 1990, socialists started calling themselves progressives. So it's strange because progressives are similar to socialists in some ways and the opposite in other ways. So but what we think of progressive today is not very similar to what progressives were in the progressive era.
So why would the socialists attack them? Or
well, they said that Marx called land value tax the capitalist last ditch, and they said that it would save the capitalists from being taxed at all, which is kind of odd because Marx had mixed land in with capital. So by Marx's own definitions, land value tax would tax the capitalists. But they attacked the labor movement because they basically attacked movements that did not involve more government control and more socialism. So the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor saw Marxists particularly as their enemies. And George said, you know, we've had nothing but trouble since we began getting anarchists and socialists in our organizations. It was also partly, I think, a difference between a class struggle approach and a problem-solving approach. That, you know, there's certain things that are wrong and we should make them right. And the fact that rich people and poor people, you know, obviously rich people benefit from injustices, but their focus was remove the injustice. And it was never tax the rich for the sake of taxing the rich. It was always tax the rich on something they shouldn't have in the first place.
okay,
So
thank you. Guillaume, any comment?
Yeah, I think it's a very important point, namely the relationship between many progressives and socialism at the time. This is why I stressed that for the first generation of progressives who came back from Germany, who came back to the US from Germany in the 80s, 1880s, many of them had in mind that the reform in the US should take the same form than the reform in Germany. So they called for an activist state, and for many other thinkers of the time, they attacked them for this reason, because they didn't want the state. The state was not a source of progress for their opponents. But they firmly believe in that, in this institution, because for them, this institution embodied a new moral for the American society, and this was very important. But on the other hand, these progressives were not in favor of Marxism, because they didn't want that a revolution occurred in the US. They were in favor of slow reforms instead. They were looking for a kind of a third way between total economic liberalism and Marxism. And I also think that for this reason, the First World War changed a lot of things for these progressives, because the state was attacked for implementing bad policies, like in Germany of the time, and they lost some influence also for this reason. I have read some, for instance, for some attacks coming from Irving Fisher, stressing for his first address as a president of the American Economic Association in 1817, that Fisher said we cannot rely on the state, and us as economists, we cannot say that the state is good for the economy. We have to set the market free, because when you start relying on the state, you are going to turn to the war or imperialism or to big problems, and we have to get rid of that. So it was also the end of the ideals of progressivism of the time.
Okay, very interesting. I want to turn to the next question in the audience, but all right, let's go with the audience, because what you mentioned just now about how there was this methodological shift, right, and the change in thoughts around World War I. I guess I'll give you a preview. I'm curious about the events in 1917 in Russia, and then the sort of subsequent changes, and how that influenced through the 20th century sort of the progressive movement and just general policy making in the West. But let's leave this for later. We have to turn to the audience first. Diana, do you have a question? And then after, there's Daniel, who also.
Oh, I had just mentioned another thought about capitalism that some have expressed, is that the ability to create financial capital directly without accumulating capital from profits or what have you. Just simply the bank credit method of simply creating gigantic amounts of purchasing power to launch enterprises, and also takeovers is a big thing nowadays.
Okay, and actually, yep, I do have one question prepared on this topic, and then I'll leave it for another time again. Daniel, please go ahead.
Hey, I think your school is great. I actually enrolled in the sustainable entrepreneurship
Oh, wow.
that they're putting on. So, and I ran with some Georgist ideas as a city council candidate for the second time here in Thousand Oaks, California, and also as a transhumanist party member. Did like about 3 or 4 online Zoom forums with the League of Women Voters. So anyway, I doubled my vote count, which is pretty impressive for spending no money. Went from like 2,000 votes to basically 5,000 votes. Anyway, I'm planning to run again in 2022 with transhumanist and Georgist ideas. But I put in the chat a new domain I have called coupon.info. And I think Georgists could use this, and also transhumanists and ham radio people and Esperantists. And basically, it's a way of doing kind of what Marcus Garvey was advocating, like black capitalism, where people of similar ideological bents would give each other preferential treatment in the marketplace. Because I think that's kind of the heart of progressivism, is reducing unearned inequality and adding earned equalities, where this kind of seems to be the good strategy. So I think this will be a parallel strategy that can work well alongside of politics. So we can really make government obsolete if we just ramp up the voluntary activity sphere.
Wouldn't that be a form of a government?
Great, right?
Even if it's volunteer, isn't that a form of a government already? Because someone has to coordinate the volunteer effort.
Well, I mean volunteer in the sense of voluntary human interactions, minimizing coercion in all interactions.
I'm coming into this as unprepared as one could be. So
thanks.
Yeah, thank you for sharing this. Maybe we go to the next question. Joe, please go ahead. Joe Polito?
Yep, hi.
Yeah. Hi.
Great presentation. Really thought you did a nice job, and it really helped to, it's a great introduction to the book. My question for you was about the use of your term equality of opportunity. Many advocates for that have emphasize the economic side of it. For example, Martin Luther King said, what good does it do you to have the right to go to a restaurant if you don't have the money to afford food? In 1944, Roosevelt proposed a series of rights, economic rights. He was proposing that the United States should have an economic Bill of Rights. And the list was a short one, but it's something we'd all want for our children and loved ones: a living wage job, an education, healthcare, housing, social insurance like pension. Today, he might have added daycare and climate security. I just wondered what you include in your concept of equality of opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your positive words and on my presentation and for your question. I think in the American case, it's an old question because, for instance, Alexis de Tocqueville, when he went to the US and wrote his book de la démocratie en Amérique, this is what is stressed already in his book. He was very impressed by the way Americans try to improve the equality of opportunity, which means in his mind that Americans try to create a positive environment for all in order for them to reach a kind of personal achievement. So of course, it was his view, but I think this is to some extent what the progressives of the time had in mind in order to create and to improve the equality of opportunity. I will focus maybe on the author I know most, namely Albion Small, because in a Small's view, I can say that there were three main ways in order to improve the equality of opportunity. First, taxation. Taxation is a good way to reduce the power of some people and to be able to create a new environment, a new positive environment for the most part of the population. For instance, when he stressed the need to tax stockholders, it was to be able to create a small new firms, especially at the city level. So it was a good way for him to improve the social bonds and the cohesion of people. Second, these Albion Small firmly believed in the power of education. Collective education, especially in universities, is a good way to spread knowledge to everyone and then to empower people. So this is why also he wrote pedagogical books with Dewey, for instance, on the power of knowledge. And third, Small really believed in the possibility to change and redesign the inner organization of firms. In his view, there was a possibility to gather capitalists and the workers through new internal bodies within the firm. He had in mind what he called small corporations within the firms that could be able to gather capitalists and workers in order to reconciliate them and to avoid the class warfare. Of course, and this is in line with one of the previous questions, for that reason, he was also attacked by socialists because some socialists said, if you do that, you are going to be close to the owners of the firm, and then you will not be able to really help the workers in the US. And maybe it was true to some extent because Small was financed by Rockefeller, who gave him, who financed the Department of Sociology of the time. And for instance, Small earned every year $70,000 per year coming from the funds of Rockefeller. So it was a huge salary for the time. So I think this was a way for him to. When I say so, 2 big tips and a big ass dildo, 3 gunshots when you. Now that's blueberry Gago. 1 false move and me suck your whole dick. 2 small bands, niggas doing some bondage. 3 more bros, pull up. So it goes, cause come on my damn lips. 1 big. Is it a progressive song? I don't know.
I think we're being attacked. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need to mute Karim.
So I think that Small had this idea of improving the equality of opportunity through these 3 ways.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I got distracted because I think somebody was trying to.
It already happened with Louis-Philippe Rochon.
Oh yeah. Once. Oh, there he is. Hi, Louis-Philippe. Thanks for joining us. All right, let's move on. I think we are good as far as questions in the chat room, but the next question was from Yanis, I think. And Yanis, we see Haya Sophia, but we don't see you. The virtual background is kind of, but please go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Yanis, you've got to unmute yourself. All right, go ahead now.
Sorry, I was away for a second. I just came right on time.
Okay. That's what I meant. That we see the cathedral, but not you.
Oh, yes, Sophia. Yeah. That's what it is. Well, my question would go back, and I hope I'm not gonna take the stage from Alexander, because he said he wants to ask again about the role of government, and I wanted to talk again about what role does an institution like the government play. And let me tell you a little bit, my take on the government is a super powerful private corporation. If you really think what government is a group of individuals which act together, and they have their own interests. They're supposed to be acting theoretically on the public good, but basically they're acting in self-interest, and they have immense power and privilege over everybody else. So if one had to choose what would be the ideal world according to the progressives, to me it sounds almost logical that should be one with no government, right? So the question is, how can we limit government to be what government is theoretically supposed to be doing? Do we have a prescription for that? Do the progressive have a prescription for that? And if there is no prescription, then how do we stop that private corporations for overtaking everybody else in the economy and setting up the stage for the inequalities and the injustices that ensue from this government provided and guaranteed private privilege? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and important question. Once again, I'm going to focus more on Small and Elie, who are maybe the most representatives of these progressives. First, I would like to remind that when these thinkers created the social sciences in the US, including economics, they had in mind that they wanted to create a kind of moral social science at large, because these thinkers were really close to religion, especially close to Christianity. And I am saying that because in their view, it means that the social sciences were the new way, a new mean to concretize one of some of the projects and the ideas of religion. And they firmly believed that the state had a kind of moral dimension. The state, like God to some extent, was above individuals. So as an institution, they were they believed that the state was able to implement some kind of neutral policies, in the sense that the state would help everybody thanks to its policy. The state had a moral dimension going beyond the interest of different people and the possibility of a kind of capture you mentioned. So I think it's really important. And in their view, the good way to limit the bad influence, I can say that, the bad influence of government or of the state on the economy, and the bad example for them was Germany during the World War I. The good way to limit the power of people was that politicians should rely on the expertise coming from social scientists. For them, the social scientists has a kind of a mission, namely to help the government to devise and to implement the right policies for everybody. So, of course, there were also, as I have mentioned, some debates on the link between the people and the experts at that time. But for them, they really believe in this kind of, to borrow from Ely, of this kind of intellectual aristocracy. They firmly believe that experts were there to as a guide for the nation.
Okay, one might be reminded of Keynes's statement about how it's the economists and political scientists really behind it all. Ed Dodson, you have one more question. Please go ahead.
Well, actually, I just wanted to point those of you who are interested in doing more research to this period, that a project that I began back in 1997 was to try to document the history of the Georgist movement and how it interacted with Fabian socialists, as well as the individualist movement on the right, etc. And one way that I've been able to do this is by taking all of the publications that were produced during this era. In the United States, it began with a publication called the Single Tax Review, which changed its name in the 1920s to Land and Freedom. And what I've done is found just about every one of the issues, and I've scanned them and then broken them down into individual article by article. So if you go to the year of the publication, you get a sense of the evolving discussion that occurred on all of these issues at the time that they were occurring. So what people were thinking and feeling during the 1890s and then the early 1900s, during the First World War, the 1920s, and into the Great Depression. And these publications had contributors from all over the Georgist world. So they would get reports from France or from Spain or from the United Kingdom, from Russia, wherever anyone held to these ideas. So what I've tried to do is provide for researchers this as a source of really good material. And I think there are many books that can come out of it, and many articles. So if some of you know that my website is called the School of Cooperative Individualism. So if you go to that website, which is www.cooperative-individualism.org, all of this material is there, and it's still a work in progress. The Land and Freedom periodical went all the way up until 1943, and I'm just finishing 1933. So I'm just pointing you to a source of a lot of really good, insightful writing into what was going on in the minds of people in this period.
Thank you. Actually, Ibrahima just posted the link to your website.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And Daniel has a question. Did Georgists interact with Okay, go ahead, Daniel. Maybe you'd like to ask your question yourself.
Hey, let me unmute. Sorry. Yeah, I think about that time you had like the Wobblies, the International Workers of the World movement. I wonder if there was any documented, interaction with that. And a follow-up kind of thing, I noticed the Venus Project, resource-based economy, post-money people, their movement is sort of falling apart. And I think Georgist ideas are kind of ripe for the injecting into that movement. So it's kind of two questions folded together.
Thank you.
I don't know who wants to take that.
Not me.
I guess I'm kind of asking that in a general sense about, where Georgist ideas can be most fruitfully inoculated into movements that have, some common overlap.
Not to put all the pressure on our guest, maybe Ibrahima, Marty would you like to step in?
You can go first, Ibrahima.
Go ahead, Marty, go ahead. I was actually going to suggest you go.
No, I thought that was an interesting point that Daniel was making, where we can intervene, because I guess at some point when something's not intellectually comprehensive, things just kind of fall apart. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. We can always, run for office and try to change the tax code. I mean, we do have Joshua Vincent on this event, so he could probably address what some things are being done on the ground right now. But one of the things that I think is important is to get people to think through exactly what Henry George is trying to say. And I put a paper together that you can find on my academia.edu site called Zero Priced Land. And I think that's really the essence of what Henry George was getting at, is that getting land to the point of either zero or near zero price, so that there's no opportunity for speculation. And I think one of the problems is with our political movement to getting that enacted is just the concept of breaking land away from the improvements. And it's difficult for people to think through, and, am I getting suckered into something else? And what about the income tax? Can't we get it to get switched at the same time? So we've got some practical things that we need to work on.
Okay, thank you, Ibrahima. Do you want to say anything or continue?
Just go ahead, continue.
Okay, so from what I can tell, by the way, we're having a very active conversation in the chat room, everyone. So please make sure you scroll up, down. There's updates coming up all the time. So Guillaume, you've motivated an intellectual storm here. So that's wonderful. But if I'm correct, and if I'm not mistaken, rather, then what we have as our next person asking a question. Oh, and things just shifted for me. Oh yes, Guy Comaclo, I think.
Yeah.
Yep. Please go ahead.
I would like to ask a question to Guillaume. Earlier you talked about the government, and I have the impression that you were talking about the Concordat in France. Is it the case? Do you hear what?
Yeah.
Do you hear what I said?
Yep. Yeah, we heard you.
Yeah. No. You mean when I was talking about the influence religion had on these thinkers? Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Thank you for your question. It was not the same in France. The government really had to devise a global agreement with the Catholic authorities in order to create new rules, as you are referring to the Concordat. It was not the same with these American thinkers. Of course, they were really influenced by religion. Some of them.
Just before you continue, you know, we got two parties. You got the Protestant and the Catholics. In some ways, the Republicans and the Democrats. So it's the same thing. You know, everybody come with his own way of thinking, and they impose their wills. So that's why I was talking about the Concordat.
Yes, but it was not the same at all in the US with these thinkers. They just wanted to promote religious ideas in the sense that they would people in the US to be to increase the fraternity, to increase brotherhood, to increase social bonds. They didn't talk about a national agreement between the different religions. They thought that the knowledge coming from the social sciences was close to some religious writings, and they just wanted to promote the ideas. They didn't really talk about the way to about the worship of God, or the kind of political organization dealing with the different religions. They just wanted to promote brotherhood and fraternity. And this is why they talked about morals, and this is why they related social sciences to religion. But it was not the same than in France. And for instance, this is why your question is interesting. This is why there are also a difference between, for instance, the sociology of small and the sociology of Émile Durkheim in France, because Durkheim had more in mind this kind of secularism you are talking about with the Concordat.
Yeah, you know, I was thinking about the Concordat because, you know, the French were very involved here in the United States, because you got a fraternity called the Cincinnati, which is French. So you know, the is very related in some ways with what you're talking about.
Okay, thank you very much for your comment and your question.
Yep.
It's really important.
Thank you. Yep, thank you very much. I mean, by the way, we're now at this for 1.5 hours, just to let everyone know. So, this is how long this seminar has been, and I think it's fully covers, at least when I teach, that's the time for one lecture. So this is very interesting. So we should try to wrap up things. I have my own set of questions, but maybe I'll connect with what was just what Guillaume and Guy were discussing, and that is the motivation for the thinkers and the policymakers and so on. In the book, Guillaume, you mentioned how the progressive Europe activists and individuals, economists, social scientists, and so on were shared noble motivations. I think you used that word, noble, and it was interesting to see that, right? It was noble motivations among the members of the progressive movement at the time. And you sort of touched on this earlier when you talked about those, the foundation for that. But how can we rather, or is there a way, or should we even try to compare this to today? Somehow, sort of what motivates policy today? Has it become more sort of technocratic rather than more about ideas? You spoke also about how we need economists, going back to the point that's already made, who propose ideas rather than just solve equations, so to speak. Maybe a little bit more on this, if you could expand.
Thank you very much, Alec, for your question, because it's really important, in my view, to understand both the legacy of these intellectuals and maybe also their failure to some extent. Because, of course, they had very noble motivations, especially because they firmly believed in morals, as I have stressed. And I think this is one of the legacies we should have in mind today, in the sense that, as I have mentioned, maybe the specialization of science, which is a long process, which is a trend. We cannot maybe go against such a trend, but we should be aware of its consequences, and its consequences are that we are maybe too specialized, especially as social scientists. And when these thinkers talked about morals, they wanted to stress that we should rely on kind of embedded social sciences, an embedded knowledge, academic knowledge. This is why I said that we should not be mere technicians as economists. I think it's very important, and this is in relation, this is in line with their noble motivations. But to another extent, on the other end, this is maybe one of the reasons some of them failed in the history of ideas, because I am working on Albion small thought, but who really knows small today? There are a few persons who really knows small, while he was very influential at the time. And maybe because they were too close to morals and to some maybe religious ideas, they failed, and they digged their own hole to some extent, because they didn't see the rise in empirism in the social sciences from the 20s onwards. They didn't see the arrival of and the importance of neoclassical economists at the same period, and they didn't know really how to answer to some to these economists, and this is why I wanted to say they, of course, they had very strong noble motivations. They had a strong ethics of conviction, but maybe this is one of the reasons some of them failed in the history of the thought.
Very interesting. Ibrahima adds to the point, asking perhaps we should switch back from economics to political economy.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I think. All right, but we should probably conclude now. Ibrahima, I don't know if you caught that. There's a request from Daniel, and I think from pretty much every participant, to somehow save the discussion in the chat room and share it with everyone.
Yes, I would do that. And I have a favor to ask from all of you. We are trying to really see the impact of our advertisement. We are using different sources. So a short poll should help us do that. Can you see anything displayed on your screen?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Yeah. Please go ahead. And I also would like to let you, and I've been doing it for a while now, if you like what you the event that we had today, and you want to have many more of these, we would like to really count on you if you can make a tax-deductible donation from the school's website, sgss.org. Just click on the donate button. Any amount is fine. Thank you very much.
Also, if you hit copy and paste, go to chat, do Control-A to mark it all, and hit copy and paste, you will get
all the chat.
You will get the entire chat.
Very good. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, try. It didn't work for me, but try.
Yeah.
I joined Ibrahima's call in supporting the school's mission and school's work. We've been putting quite a lot of interesting events, especially today's very interesting discussion, so such as this one. And of course, what helps to talk about great ideas and make them even greater is some material backing to have an opportunity to discuss these things. Ibrahima, let me know when the poll is done.
Yeah, it's still going.
Okay, so then when, I don't know, I can always ask more questions, but
I have, Alexander, I don't know, I have one.
Go ahead.
I mean, yes, and touches back to, it's in the same line of thought as Guy's question on the kind of like the movement histories in France. And the reason I asked that is because a few years ago I had met Etienne Balibar, who is probably one of the foremost Marxists on the planet right now. And I had asked him a question which was related. His talk was about capitalism, and then I asked him kind of like a Georgist question. And then afterwards he came and he talked to me on the reception. He says, you know, my father was a Georgist, and he talked about his father was a Georgist in France, right, some time ago. But of course, I mean, he became a Marxist. But it prompted me. I wanted to know more about Georgism in France, and I don't know, Guillaume, since we have you here, maybe you can shed a little bit of light on the Georgist history of the history of the Georgist movement in France.
Thank you for your question, but I am sorry that I am not able to answer to that. I'm not aware of the influence of Georgism in France. Sorry to disappoint you.
Something to research. All right. Okay.
But I will try to know more. Thank you.
Ibrahim, I see the poll is done.
Yeah.
So looks like the newsletter is working. I think that's the conclusion.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
So thank you, everyone. All right. So I guess we're done. Thank you very much to our audience, but most of all, thank you, Guillaume, for your time, for sharing your expertise with us. I learned a lot. I took a lot of notes. I'll have to read them again. But come again.
Exactly.
And Ibrahima and everyone from Henry George School, thank you for organizing this and giving the opportunity for us to have this conversation today.
Good job, Al.
Thank you, everybody. And merci.
Thank you very much.
Guillaume.
Okay.
Merci, and thank you very much to all of you. It was my pleasure. And feel free to get in touch. You got my email address if you want to know more. Feel free to send me an email.
And most importantly, everyone has the link to the book. So please go ahead and purchase the book.
Very good.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.